AI feels like it's everywhere right now. You open YouTube, LinkedIn, X, wherever, and there's always something new, a new tool, a new update, a new take on what's coming next. A lot of it is framed around what you should already be doing or what you're about to miss out on if you don't act quickly. When you're surrounded by that kind of conversation, it's very easy to start assuming that most people are already deep into this, that everyone else has figured it out and you're the one trying to catch up. I feel that too. What helped me get some clarity was stepping back, looking at the data instead of staying in the conversation. Once I did that, my understanding of where we actually are shifted quite a bit. There's a useful parallel here that just helps me explain why the noise can be misleading. Did you know that in medicine, something interesting has been happening recently that's not in the news? There have been human trials using gene editing that point toward a very different way of treating chronic conditions. For decades, most medical treatments have followed a similar pattern. You take something regularly, daily, weekly, monthly, and as long as you keep taking it, the condition stays under control. It works, but it's a continuous management loop. What's being tested now takes a different approach. Instead of managing the condition again and again, it changes how certain liver cells behave at a genetic level. In these trials, people received a single infusion. That was the intervention, one infusion. After that, their cholesterol levels dropped and stayed low. There was no ongoing medication cycle built into the model. This is still early stage work and it's not widely available, but if this approach actually continues to hold up, it represents a real shift in how we think about medical treatment going forward. It moved from long-term management towards long-term correction. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is just how little attention this received. It's a development that can potentially change how we treat diseases. It influences how chronic diseases are treated for decades without dominating headlines or feeds. And that is my point. Importance and visibility don't always move together. Some of the changes that matter most advance steadily without a lot of noise. AI sits at the other end of that spectrum. It generates a huge amount of attention. It's discussed constantly, speculated about endlessly, and often framed in very urgent terms. And that level of exposure can make it feel like everything is happening at once and like everyone else is already on board. So instead of relying on how that feels, I wanted to look at what adoption actually looks like. When you look at the data across 147 countries, only about 16% of the global working age population had used AI at least once in the second half of 2025. A simple way to think about this: imagine a gym with 100 members, but only 16 of them train constantly. You notice them because they're visible and they're active, not because they represent the majority. Most people either haven't used AI at all or have only interacted with it indirectly through products that include it in the background. When you break this down by region, the picture actually becomes a lot clearer. The UAE stands out, obviously, with very high adoption driven by early investment and a national focus on AI infrastructure. That's an exception. That is not the baseline. In places like the UK, adoption sits much closer to the global average. There's a lot of discussion and visibility, but everyday usage remains fairly limited. In South Africa, adoption is even lower again. Factors like access, infrastructure, skills, and incentives all shape how quickly new technology spreads. Context matters far more than the online conversations suggest. If you go by what shows up in your feed, it's easy to assume that everyone is already using AI in meaningful ways. The data tells a very different story. And that disconnect really surprised me because it didn't match my own day-to-day experience. I use AI regularly. I follow the news closely. I work with clients who actively apply it. When you spend time in that environment, it's easy to lose perspective and assume the rest of the world is at the same stage. Looking at the data made it clear that most people are still very early in this process. The broader world is moving more slowly than the loudest conversations imply. And that realization changed how I think about this. If you're already experimenting with AI, even in small or imperfect ways, you're part of a relatively small group. Relative to the people around you, you're in the early shift. That is really worth taking seriously. The feeling of being behind usually comes from comparing yourself to the most visible voices, not from what's actually happening across businesses and industries. Many people are still observing. They're still waiting or unsure where to start. If you're already learning and testing, you're ahead of the broader curve. So, what do you do with that position? First, slow down. Constant urgency pushes people into reactive decisions. The data shows there's room. Second, orient yourself. Look closely at where your business actually spends time and effort. Pay attention to where work feels repetitive or where things constantly slow down. Then plan a small number of specific uses. Keep them tied to real work and real outcomes so you can learn what actually makes a difference. And then act consistently. Small actions repeated over time. That is what builds understanding. That understanding compounds into leverage. AI is creating a lot of noise right now, but adoption is very different. That gap between noise and reality is where the opportunity sits. If this way of looking at AI resonates with you, you'll probably find the rest of the content here useful as well. And if you're already experimenting, I'd genuinely like to hear how you are using it. Context and experience matter far more than tools. So to sum it up, in this video, I wanted to tell you just how our anxiety from feeling overwhelmed is actually not the reality. And in fact, it is actually an opportunity where we can calm down and be the early adopters still in this stage. We are still far from everyone knowing and even using AI.